Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of A Killer Hides from Father Brown, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Rain Fell Red. The rain had been falling since dusk, and by midnight it no longer sounded like weather. It was more like penance. The city swallowed it, gutter by gutter, alley by alley, until even the night seemed to wear a wet sheen of regret. Neon signs buzzed with weary defiance, casting colors over the slick streets that had no business being beautiful. Red and violet light clung to the rain-slicked pavement, like the last lipstick of a dead starlet. A saxophone wailed somewhere, just out of reach, like a confession whispered too late. Father Brown walked with his hands folded inside his worn overcoat, the collar turned up against the cold. He was a round little man with spectacles that caught the street lamp glow in harmless flickers. A priest didn't belong in a part of town like this, not among the crooked-jawed thugs, painted dames, and men who carried their sins like switchblades. But Father Brown never looked like he belonged anywhere until he spoke, and by then it was too late. He passed the Lucky Saint Bar just as the door swung open, letting out a coil of smoke and laughter soaked in gin. A woman stepped into the light, tall, dangerous, and dressed like trouble, had a taste for satin. She lit a cigarette with the air of someone used to watching men fold under her gaze. She saw the priest, squinted through the smoke, and smiled like she'd just seen a ghost who owed her money. "You lost, Father?" she asked, her voice low and smooth, the kind that left bruises you didn't notice until morning. "Not lost," Father Brown said, stopping, "just walking towards something." She leaned against the brick wall, one heel kicked back like she was striking a pose for a crime scene photo. "They don't send your kind down here unless someone's dead." Father Brown looked up at the building across the street. 3 stories of brick and broken promises. A light was on in the top window, flickering behind cheap curtains. "Not dead yet," he said quietly, "but dying. A little more every hour." "You here for the girl?" she asked, eyes narrowing. Father Brown didn't answer. He just looked at her, and in that silent moment, she seemed to flinch. Not with fear, but recognition. The way people do when they realize you see past their lies. She laughed, short and sharp. "She's not the confessional type, Padre, and you're a few Hail Marys too late." Father Brown tipped his hat, the rain dripping from the brim. "No one is beyond confession," he said, "only hiding from it." She didn't watch him walk away, but she smoked that cigarette like it was burning something out of her she couldn't name. The girl was named Evelyn Ma. 23, chorus girl turned lounge act, turned something else when the spotlight dimmed. She'd gone missing 2 nights ago after a show at the Velvet Knife, a jazz joint that had changed owners more times than it had cleaned the carpet. Her landlady reported her missing, but the cops didn't care. Girls like Evelyn disappeared all the time, sometimes into shadows, sometimes into trunks. Most of the time, nobody looked, except someone had. A letter came to St. Dominic's the next morning, postmarked from a neighborhood where mailboxes got torched for sport. No return address, just a single line written in careful, delicate script. She's not dead yet. But they want her to be. Come alone. So Father Brown did. The velvet knife was bleeding. Saxophone when he entered, the sound curling like cigarette smoke around the low-lit room. Men in fedoras nursed bad whiskey and worse memories. The bartender gave Father Brown a look like he'd just stepped in something. "You lost, Padre?" he grunted, wiping a glass with a towel older than sin. "I'm here to speak with a man named Cal Morrigan," Father Brown said pleasantly. The bartender's hand paused mid-polish. He set the glass down carefully. "No priest walks in here asking for Cal unless he's reading him his last rites." Father Brown gave a mild smile. "Let's hope that's not necessary." The back room was thick with smoke and silence. Cal Morrigan sat behind a desk the size of a coffin, flanked by two men who looked like they moonlighted as executioners. Morrigan was fat, florid, and smelled like expensive cigars and cheap loyalty. "I don't take confessions, Father," Morrigan said, not bothering to stand. "You want a sermon? Try Sunday." "I'm not here for a sermon," Father Brown said, stepping into the haze. "I'm here for Evelyn Marr." Morrigan blinked once, slowly. "Never heard of her." "Then you should choose your staff more carefully," Father Brown replied. "Your girl outside, the one with the red dress and the 1,000-yard smile, seems to know her well." That got Morrigan's attention. A flick of the eyes. Nothing more. But Father Brown saw it. He always did. "People go missing in this town, Father," Morrigan said. "Sad, but not illegal. You looking for a body? Call the river. You looking for a miracle? Call the Pope." "I'm looking for the truth," Father Brown said quietly. "But most people mistake that for a threat." One of the bodyguards chuckled, low and cold. "You're a strange kind of priest." Father Brown turned to him. "On the contrary, I'm a very ordinary one. I just happen to know what sin looks like when it puts on a tuxedo." Morrigan stood, hands on the desk. "You walk in here dressed like mercy and talk like judgment. But this isn't your parish. You think a collar makes you bulletproof?" "No," Father Brown said, his voice calm as an old hymn. "But it means I don't need one." They let him go, not because they believed him, but because men like Morrigan didn't know what to do with someone who didn't flinch. He found Evelyn Marr in an abandoned chapel on the edge of the district, where stained glass still caught lightning and the pews were full of dust instead of devotion. She was sitting beneath the altar, cradling something in her lap. "I used to sing here," she said, without looking up, "before the city got to me." "I know," Father Brown said, stepping into the half-light. "That's why I came." She looked up then, eyes wide, haunted, but not surprised. "They're going to kill me." "No," he said gently. "You're going to let them." Her face twisted. "You don't know what they've done. What I've done." "I know enough," he said. "You tried to leave. You knew too much. And someone made you think your life wasn't worth keeping." She pressed her hands to her face. "I saw Cal kill a man. A cop. I saw the payoff. I saw the body get dumped behind the casino. I told a reporter. I thought it would matter." "It does matter," Father Brown said, "just not to the people you hoped." She looked at him with something like desperation. "What do I do?" "You confess," he said simply. "Not to me, to the world, and you don't hide any more." "They'll come for me." "They already have," Father Brown said, "but they'll never expect you to walk toward them." The trap was simple. Evelyn went back to the knife, took the stage again. Morrigan thought she'd folded. He sent word to finish the job after the last set. But when the curtain fell, it wasn't Evelyn waiting in the wings. It was Father Brown, and two men in trench coats who weren't drinking for pleasure. The cops came hard, led by a lieutenant who owed the church more favors than he liked to admit. Morrigan went quietly, but not before turning to Father Brown and saying, "You think you've won, priest?" Father Brown looked at him. "You think I was playing your game?" The city didn't change overnight. The rain kept falling. The streets stayed hungry. But Evelyn Marr left town with a name cleared and a second chance packed in her suitcase like an old song she wasn't done singing. Father Brown returned to St. Dominic's. He polished the brass, swept the floors, listened to confessions. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain began to fall and the city whispered like a dying man, he'd stand at the chapel door and watch the red neon flicker across the wet stones like blood in a font, and he would murmur, half to the dark, half to himself, "It's not always the crime that damns a man. It's the lie he tells to live with it." Chapter 2. A Confession in Smoke. The night tasted of burnt tobacco and cheap fear. Smoke curled from the alleys like whispered regrets, rising past the broken neon letters of the Belladonna Club and vanishing into the fogged-up sky. Rain had fallen earlier, but now the streets just glistened with the memory of it, as if the city was trying to wash off something it couldn't forget. The Belladonna's red sign blinked weakly, like a guilty conscience, pretending it had nothing to hide. Father Brown stood outside the club for a moment, looking absurd in his long brown coat and soft felt hat, as out of place as a hymn at a funeral run by crooks. He could hear the music inside, low, sultry jazz played by musicians who had long since stopped dreaming, and the muffled sound of laughter that didn't reach the eyes. He stepped in. The Belladonna was the kind of place that looked better in shadows. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and smoke, and both clung to the furniture like they'd paid rent. A few hard men leaned against the bar, drinking from heavy glasses and talking in tones that sounded casual but carried knives underneath. A woman on stage sang about love like it was something she'd buried years ago and couldn't be bothered to mourn. No one noticed the priest at first, or pretended not to. He made his way to the corner, where the light was dim and the walls smelled of mildew and secrets. He ordered tea. They laughed. The bartender gave him hot water and a chipped cup, like it was a dare. Father Brown didn't flinch. He never did. She found him before he found her. That was always the way with people who had something to hide. Her name was Madeline Sharp. She slid into the booth across from him, like smoke into a confessional, elegant, dangerous, wearing a black dress that fit like it knew better. Her eyes were dark, but not with innocence. "You're the priest," she said, not a question. "I am," said Father Brown, stirring his tea. "Odd place for a man of God." "God goes where he's needed," he replied softly. She lit a cigarette, the flame dancing briefly in the reflection of her eyes. "You're not here for a sermon, are you?" "No," Father Brown said. "I'm here about Walter Kahn." That made her hand pause for half a second. Most wouldn't have noticed, but Father Brown wasn't most. "Never heard of him," she said coolly. "You do quite well at not hearing things," Father Brown said, "considering you were engaged to him." She blew smoke toward the ceiling. He disappeared. People disappear. "True," said Father Brown, "but the ones who vanish right before they expose someone tend to disappear in more permanent ways." Madeline tilted her head. "You think I had something to do with it?" I think you're hoping I'll think you didn't, he said, his voice calm, even kind. There was a silence between them, full of clinking glasses and the low rumble of a saxophone in mourning. She leaned in. You don't know what kind of man Walter was. He played at being noble, but he had debts, enemies. He owed the wrong people. And he told you things, Father Brown said. Things about Inspector Bannon. Her face changed slightly. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation. She was adjusting her mask, and Father Brown saw it slip for just a moment. Enough. Bannon's the kind of man who burns files and calls it justice, she said finally. If Walter said something, he was signing his death warrant. And yet, Father Brown murmured, you didn't warn him. I warned him plenty. He just didn't listen. No, Father Brown agreed. People rarely do when they think they're the hero of their own story. She stubbed out her cigarette, her fingers twitching just once. You want to find him? Try the old paper mill off 12th, but don't expect a warm welcome. I never do, Father Brown said. The mill sat like a corpse at the edge of the city, windows broken, graffiti like battle scars across the brick. Father Brown stepped over the rusted fence with the patience of a man entering a ruined church. Inside, the smell of damp and rot clung to the air like a secret. They were waiting for him. 3 men, shadows stitched together with bad tempers and brass knuckles. One had a toothpick, the other a scar that looked like it had a story, and the third didn't bother hiding the gun at his hip. You the priest? The one with the toothpick asked. I try to be, Father Brown said. Then you ought to be somewhere holy. Every place becomes holy if you stand there long. Enough, Father Brown said, smiling faintly. Even this one. Cute, said the one with the scar. But cute don't get you out of here. I'm not trying to get out, Father Brown said. I'm trying to understand. The one with the gun laughed. Understand what, Padre? Why men like you think you can bury sin beneath concrete and call it justice? Toothpick stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. You think you're safe 'cause you wear a collar? I think, Father Brown said, unmoving, that people who hide behind violence are often afraid of something they can't hit. Scar stepped closer, eyes narrowing. You want to know what happened to Khan? He got smart. Then he got dead. Truth has a funny way of outlasting the people who speak it, Father Brown replied, especially when it's covered in lies. There was a beat of silence. Then the one with the gun stepped back and nodded. This guy ain't gonna shut up. You're right, Father Brown said. I won't. They didn't hit him. He could tell. They wanted to. But they were waiting on someone's orders. Probably Bannon. And Bannon, for all his corruption, was careful. You didn't beat a priest to death unless you wanted questions. Questions led to truth, and truth was poison in a place like this. So, they let him go. Outside, the rain had started again. Soft, steady, like a rosary, whispered over a grave. Father Brown walked back toward the city, his shoes soaking through. He didn't mind. Sometimes you had to be washed in filth to bring out what was clean. The next morning, Inspector Bannon arrived at St. Dominic's. He didn't knock. He just opened the chapel doors and stood there, like a cop in a confessional, full of the kind of authority that could be revoked with one good story. You poked your nose into something foul, Father. That's where the rot is, Father Brown said, lighting a candle. Hard to find it in the flower beds. Don't get clever. I've never tried, Father Brown said. Bannon stepped closer. Walter Khan was a drunk, a gambler. He got in over his head. With you, Bannon's eyes narrowed. Careful. I am, Father Brown said. That's why I haven't gone to the papers, yet. Bannon leaned in. You think people care what a priest says in a city like this? I think, Father Brown said softly, that some truths cut deeper than bullets, and the right one, whispered in the right ear, could bury you. Bannon stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and left without another word. That night, Father Brown returned to the Belladonna. Madeline was on stage again, singing as if she were trying to outrun a memory. He waited until she came off, lit another cigarette, and approached him with tired elegance. You're still alive, she said. For now, Father Brown replied. She exhaled smoke. So what happens next? You tell the truth, he said. About Walter, about Bannon, about everything. And if I don't? You'll spend the rest of your life running, he said. From people who already know or from yourself. Whichever catches up first. She looked away. You think confession fixes anything? It doesn't fix, Father Brown said. It frees. The papers ran the story a week later. Walter's body had been found in the river, as expected. Bannon had retired suddenly, citing health reasons. No charges, no arrests, just silence. But the silence was different now. Not the kind born of fear, but the kind that followed a song ending in the right key. Madeline left town. She sent a postcard to St. Dominic's a month later. No return address. Just 2 words. Thank you. Father Brown burned it in the chapel's small brazier, watching the flames curl around the ink like absolution. He didn't solve crimes the way other men did. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't throw punches. He just walked into places soaked in sin and left with the truth following quietly behind. The smoke still rose from the Belladonna. The streets were still wet with secrets, but somewhere, someone was sleeping easier, and in the still, empty chapel, Father Brown whispered a prayer for the dead, the guilty, and those still pretending not to be both. Chapter 3. The Man with No Reflection. The rain came down like a confession that wouldn't stop. It drummed on the awnings, bled into the gutters, and wrapped the city in a wet, sullen silence. Everything glowed with that ghostly kind of light. Neon signs, flickering like lies told too often, puddles that mirrored the broken windows above them. Somewhere down the street, a saxophone wailed behind a closed door, the kind of sound that made you think of people who once meant well and ended up meaning nothing. Father Brown stepped off the streetcar and into the oily light of Sycamore Avenue. He was wrapped in his usual brown coat, the collar turned up against the wind, a soft, black hat pulled low on his head. His spectacles were speckled with raindrops, and his shoes had long since stopped pretending they were waterproof. He looked less like a man of God, and more like someone you'd bump into by accident and forget a minute later. But people who underestimated Father Brown didn't forget him for long. The letter had been left on the chapel pew that morning. No return address, no name. Just 2 lines scrawled in a hurried, anxious hand. He walks without a shadow. He stares, and nothing stares back. Below it, an address, 221 Sycamore, and a final sentence. Please come before he vanishes again. Father Brown looked up at the building now. A once elegant boarding house turned sour with age, its paint peeling like old skin, its windows staring out blind and dark. He climbed the steps and knocked once. The door creaked open, not by any hand, but as if the house had been waiting. Inside, the hall smelled of stale smoke and boiled cabbage. A single light bulb buzzed overhead. The woman who met him wore a bathrobe, a nervous smile, and the kind of makeup that hinted she hadn't taken it off in 3 days. "You're the priest?" she asked, voice trembly as a loose light fixture. "I try to be," Father Brown said. "You sent the letter?" She nodded, glanced over her shoulder. "He's in room 4, upstairs. Won't eat, won't sleep, just sits and stares at the mirror." "People stare into mirrors all the time." "Not like this," she whispered. "Not when the mirror doesn't stare back." Father Brown climbed the narrow staircase, his hand grazing the banister, which felt sticky and cold. Room 4 was halfway down the hall. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the lights were off. A man sat in front of a cracked mirror, unmoving. The mirror was clean, but there was no reflection. Not none, but wrong. Office. The man was there, but dimmed, faded, like someone halfway out of the world. His face had sharp angles, cheekbones like cut glass, eyes that didn't blink often enough. He wore a suit with a frayed cuff and shoes that shined like lies. He didn't look at Father Brown. He looked through him. "I've been watching you," he said, voice low, like gravel rolling downhill. "That's unusual," said Father Brown gently. "Most people don't notice me until I'm standing right in front of them." The man chuckled, but it wasn't joy. It was the kind of laugh that carried the weight of something heavy and buried. "They say you solve things, that you see what others miss." "I try not to miss the obvious," Father Brown said. "It's usually hiding where no one bothers to look." The man gestured toward the mirror. "What do you see?" Father Brown stepped closer. The reflection was there, but wrong in some essential way, as though the light didn't want to touch him. Or perhaps he didn't cast any. "I see a man," said Father Brown, "but one who's forgotten what he looks like." The man's lip curled. "That's poetic, not helpful." "Poetry can be helpful when the truth is too heavy to lift plainly." The man stood. "My name is Adrian Voss, or at least that's the name I bought. The real one's been buried longer than most of my enemies." "You have many?" Voss turned to the window. "I used to run with Delancey, East Side numbers. We made good money, dirty, but good. Then I got greedy. I saw a chance to walk away clean. Take the money, start fresh. But there's no such thing as clean in a city like this. Just dirt that hasn't been seen yet." "You took something," Father Brown said, "from the wrong people." Voss looked over his shoulder, the corners of his mouth tight. "I took the books. All of them. Evidence, names, accounts, everything they buried under blood and backroom deals." "Why?" "Because I was tired of being the villain." Father Brown nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now, they want me gone, not just dead. Gone, like I never existed. The kind of erasure you don't come back from." "That's why your reflection's fading," Father Brown said softly. "You're vanishing from yourself." Voss blinked, something hard in his jaw. "That's ridiculous." "It's faith," Father Brown said. "Or the lack of it. You're punishing yourself by turning invisible. Not to them, to you." There was a silence, then footsteps in the hallway. 2 men. Big, broad, and familiar with violence. The Dar burst inward. The taller one had brass knuckles and a smile like a wolf that skipped lunch. The other had a gun. Neither looked interested in conversation. "You Father Brown?" Brass Knuckles asked. "I am," Father Brown said. "But I suspect you're not here for spiritual counsel." They chuckled. "Funny guy." Gunman looked at Voss. "Delancey wants his books back. And you gone. In that order." Voss backed toward the mirror. "I destroyed them." "No, you didn't," Father Brown said. Voss's eyes widened. "You hid them. But you didn't destroy them, because some part of you still believed in redemption, even if you didn't deserve it. Gunman raised the pistol. Too late for redemption. Father Brown didn't flinch. On the contrary, it's never too late. That's what makes it real. Brass Knuckles stepped forward. Move, priest. I will, Father Brown said, when you understand what you're really killing. Gunman scowled. We're killing a rat. You're killing the evidence, Father Brown said. And with it, any chance of justice, which means you're not just thugs, you're cleaners, and cleaners are always disposable. Gunman hesitated. You kill Voss, you take the fall, Father Brown said, voice quiet, even. Delancey's name stays clean. You become the story, you get the cuffs. That's a lie, said Brass Knuckles, but there was a tremble in his voice. Father Brown turned to him. If it is, then pull the trigger. But if it's not, you've already been erased, just like him. The silence cracked, brittle and long. Then Gunman lowered the pistol. Let's get out of here. They left. No threats, no promises, just the hurried steps of men who'd glimpsed the edge of a cliff and realized they were already leaning too far. Voss sank into the chair, breathing hard. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did, Father Brown replied, because you won't save yourself. Voss looked at the mirror. The reflection was still weak, but clearer now. Where are the books, Father? Brown asked. In a locker at the central station, Voss said, under the name John Blake. I'll send someone, Father Brown said, someone who still believes in law. Voss stood, looked at the window. Do you think, if I tell the truth, I'll come back? Father Brown adjusted his hat. You'll begin to. That night, the rain stopped. The streets still shimmered, but the light hit them differently, like they were waiting for someone to walk down them with clean shoes. Father Brown passed the Belladonna on his way home. The neon sign buzzed, as always, but somehow the red didn't seem so harsh. In the chapel, he lit a candle and sat alone, letting the silence wrap around him like a familiar coat. He wasn't a detective, he wasn't a judge, but he had learned long ago that sometimes all it took to save a soul was seeing it clearly, reflected not in a mirror, but in truth. And perhaps that was all a man really needed to find his way back. A reflection that finally looked like himself. Chapter 4. Beneath the Lamplight Cross. The rain had not stopped for days. It fell like a blanket of regret, soaking the city in the kind of dampness that settled into your bones and made every street corner look like a place where something tragic had once happened. The neon lights reflected in the puddles, flashing the same tired reds, yellows, and greens, but they couldn't quite fight the darkness that seemed to cling to the air. It was a city of shadows, a city where every face you passed seemed to hide a story, a secret, or a sin. Father Brown had grown accustomed to this city. He'd walked its streets for years, seen its beauty as well as its decay. There was something about the rain, the grime, and the smell of smoke that comforted him in a way that people couldn't. His black coat, wet at the edges and worn at the cuffs, was a small armor against the world's cruelty. His spectacles glinted in the dim light as he stepped out of the small church and into the street, the soft thud of his shoes the only sound that cut through the night's heavy silence. He had been summoned. A letter had come that morning, dropped off at the church without a return address. The message was brief, almost cryptic. Meet me beneath the Lamplight Cross at midnight. You're the only one who can help me. Father Brown knew that the request was not one made lightly. There was something behind it, a fear so palpable that it made the ink of the letter almost quiver on the page. He had seen people in need before, desperate and lost, and he understood that when someone turned to him for help, it wasn't always because of faith. Sometimes it was because they knew no one else would understand. No one else could see the truth behind the veil of lies they hid behind. The lamplight cross was an old, ironwork cross that hung on the front of an ancient church at the edge of the city's slums. It had once been a beacon, a symbol of hope, but now it was little more than a relic of the past, its light flickering weakly against the darkness. Father Brown had walked by it countless times, but tonight it felt different. He felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of inevitability that seemed to close in around him as he made his way toward the church. As he reached the street corner, he saw her standing there, beneath the dim glow of the cross, a figure draped in shadow. She was tall, almost too tall for her frame, with a long, black coat that billowed slightly in the wind. Her face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something about her posture, the way she stood as if she were waiting for something, someone, that made Father Brown stop. "You're Father Brown?" she asked, her voice low but clear, like a quiet storm, building just out of reach. "I am," Father Brown replied, his voice steady. He didn't move, just watched her, waiting for her to make the first move, as he always did. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, the sound sharp in the silence. "I need your help," she said. "I'm in trouble, terrible trouble." Father Brown said nothing, just continued to observe her, his gaze sharp behind the glasses. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to someone who was trying to manipulate you. He knew the game. People didn't ask for help unless they had no other option, and in a city like this, that meant they were already in deep. But there was something about her that struck him as different, something beyond the usual despair. "I'm listening," Father Brown said. She hesitated, then looked over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching. Her eyes were dark, not with the usual guilt or fear, but with something far colder. "I didn't mean to get involved in this mess," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's too late now. It's already started." "Started?" Father Brown asked. "Things are happening. Bad things," she said, her words rushed, as though she were afraid to speak them aloud. "People are disappearing, and I don't know who's behind it, but I know it's someone close. Someone I know. I don't know who to trust anymore." "Why come to me?" Father Brown asked, his voice calm but probing. "Because I can't go to the police," she said, looking away for a moment, as if the very thought disgusted her. "They're all involved. Everyone is in on it. The cops, the politicians, even my own father. I can't trust anyone." Father Brown raised an eyebrow. "Your father?" She nodded. "He's been in politics for years, always been in the shadows, pulling strings. But lately, things have changed. There's something darker about him now. I think he's been involved in something that's going to ruin everything." Father Brown thought for a moment. "What is it you want from me?" "I need you to find out what's happening," she said, her voice growing desperate now. "I can't do it alone. You're the only one who can see through all the lies. Please, I'm begging you." Father Brown studied her for a moment, weighing her words, sensing the fear beneath them. He didn't trust her completely. He knew better than to trust anyone who walked into his life with a story too neatly wrapped up. But there was something about her, something that tugged at the part of him that always sought the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. "Tell me everything," Father Brown said softly. She glanced around once more, then stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "It started with a disappearance," she said. "A man named Thomas Baines. He was a journalist, had been investigating something. I don't know what, but he vanished. No one knows where he went. The police don't care. They say he was just another man who got lost in the city, but I know something happened to him. I know he's not just gone." Father Brown listened intently, his mind working through the details, trying to find the connection. "What was he investigating?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling now. "But I've seen things, heard things, people talking in hushed voices. There's something terrible going on in this city, Father, and I'm afraid it's going to come for me next." Father Brown didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze back to the lamplight cross, watching the faint flicker of the light. There was something symbolic about it, something almost sacrilegious about the way the cross, meant to guide people to salvation, now stood broken and fading against the night. It mirrored the city, he realized, a city that had once had the promise of something better, but now was drowning in corruption, in darkness. "You're scared," Father Brown said, his voice soft but knowing. "But fear won't save you. You need to trust me." She looked at him, her eyes wide with anxiety. "I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Father Brown stepped closer to her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You don't have to trust anyone, but you have to face the truth. The truth is the only thing that can save you now." She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Then slowly, she nodded. "Okay, I'll tell you everything, but you have to promise me that you'll stop it. Whatever it is, whatever they're doing, you have to stop it before it's too late." "I promise," Father Brown said. He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the rain-soaked streets. He didn't know where this would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. The city was rotting from the inside out, and the truth, no matter how ugly, was the only thing that could pull it back from the edge. The next day, Father Brown visited Thomas Baines's apartment. It was in a run-down building near the docks, a place where people disappeared without a trace. The landlord, a greasy man with too many buttons undone on his shirt, was quick to tell Father Brown that Baines had been a tenant there but hadn't paid his rent in weeks. No one had seen him for days, and the place was empty now, save for a few scattered papers and a stale smell in the air. Father Brown combed through the apartment, his eyes sharp, his mind working with the precision of a man who had seen too many lives unravel. He found a series of notebooks hidden beneath a loose floorboard, filled with frantic scribblings. The writing was barely legible in some parts, but one word appeared over and over again: corruption. Father Brown felt the weight of the discovery settle in. It wasn't just a missing journalist, it was something deeper. Someone had been silencing the truth. And now they were coming for the people who knew it. He knew where this would lead him. It always did. Beneath the lamplight cross, in the darkest corners of the city, there was a sin too deep to hide. But Father Brown had spent his life unraveling such things, and he would do so again. No matter how far into the shadows he had to go. Chapter 5. The widow wore black velvet. The rain hit the pavement like a series of small, relentless punches. It wasn't a gentle rain, but one that came with purpose, washing the streets clean of something dirt, sins, memories, or all three. It didn't matter. The gutters were full, the alleyways dark, and the city, as always, was waiting to swallow anything that dared to walk through it. Neon signs flickered in the damp, casting their cold light over puddles that reflected a city of secrets. And somewhere, beneath the hum of that electric glow, Father Brown moved silently, as he always did, quiet, unassuming, like a shadow, though never without purpose. Tonight, it was the widow. She had sent for him earlier in the day, a note left under the door of St. Dominic's. "Come quickly. I need you to find the truth, before it's too late." There was an urgency in the words that struck Father Brown as odd. Not the kind of urgency born from fear of exposure, but the kind that comes when someone's very existence is about to collapse into the weight of their own lies. It was a familiar feeling, the desperation of those who know they've dug themselves into a hole too deep to climb out of. The address on the note led him to an old mansion on the edge of the city, a place that had once been grand, but now stood in decay, its once polished stones now covered in grime, its windows shuttered and grim. Father Brown knew that kind of place well. An old house with a past full of stories, secrets, and sins that had been buried long ago. The woman who lived there was a widow, but she didn't look like one, at least not in the conventional sense. Her name was Evelyn Saint Clare, and the rumors about her had circulated for years. Some said she was a grieving woman, broken by the loss of her husband. Others claimed she was a predator, luring men into her web with charm and cunning. But Father Brown had learned long ago not to trust rumors. He would meet her for himself. The door opened before he had a chance to knock, revealing a woman who looked as though she had stepped out of another time. A time when beauty was a weapon and mourning was a costume. She was tall, with raven black hair that cascaded in waves down her back, and her eyes, though shadowed by grief, held a sharpness that didn't belong to someone so young. She wore black velvet, a dress that clung to her like the past clung to the city. Her face was pale, framed by the soft, almost mournful glow of the dim light from within this mansion. "Your Father Brown?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled, and carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was the voice of someone who had been practicing control for too long. "I am," Father Brown replied, tipping his hat, studying her as he stepped inside. "You called for me." She closed the door behind him, her movements slow, deliberate. "I'm afraid I have a very delicate matter to discuss. It involves my late husband." Her eyes flickered momentarily before she caught herself. "Or rather, what happened to him?" Father Brown nodded, keeping his thoughts to himself. "I see. And you wish me to investigate his death?" Evelyn's smile was a slight curve of lips, but it was edged with something cold, something that made Father Brown pause. "I wish you to investigate the truth. About my husband. About me. About everything." He watched her for a moment, then looked around the darkened room. It smelled of dust, velvet, and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to memories. "Tell me what happened." She led him to the sitting room, where a fire burned low in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls. There was a portrait of her husband above the mantel, a man with sharp features and an air of arrogance that leaped out from the canvas. It was a face Father Brown had seen before, a face that belonged to men who thought their wealth and power could protect them from anything. "But even money, Father," Brown knew, had its limits. "I'll be frank, Father," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My husband was not the man he appeared to be. Everyone believed him to be a self-made success, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. But beneath it all, he was a liar, a cheat, a murderer." Father Brown raised an eyebrow, watching her carefully. "Murderer?" She nodded, her fingers nervously twisting a piece of lace from the hem of her sleeve. "He was involved in all sorts of unsavory dealings. Gambling, blackmail, the kind of things you don't want your name associated with. But he kept it hidden, buried deep beneath that perfect image he presented to the world." "And you know this how?" Father Brown asked, his voice calm but probing. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly to the portrait on the wall before returning to him. "I found out after our marriage. At first, I didn't believe it, but the evidence was clear. He had enemies, Father, dangerous ones." "Do you believe these enemies were responsible for his death?" Father Brown asked. Her smile returned, but this time it was colder. "I don't believe his enemies killed him. I believe he killed himself." Father Brown didn't flinch, but his mind began to work, picking apart her words. "Suicide?" "Yes," she said, "but it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. He was guilty, Father. So guilty, he couldn't live with it anymore." "And yet you came to me," Father Brown said softly. "You want me to expose the truth, but not the way it happened, do you?" She froze, her lips parting slightly as if caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You didn't call me here to investigate the death of your husband," Father Brown said, his voice quiet, like the murmur of a breeze passing through the room. "You called me because you need to hide something." She took a step back, the surprise flashing in her eyes before it was replaced by something more calculated. "You're mistaken, Father. My husband's death was no accident. He knew too much about people. He hurt them, and they hurt him back." Father Brown stepped closer, his eyes not leaving hers. "And what did you do?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Father Brown saw the cracks in her mask. "I did what I had to protect myself." Father Brown's gaze softened, but there was no pity in it, only understanding. "You helped him bury his sins, Evelyn, but now you want to bury his death." She didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the window, looking out at the darkened city below. "You think I'm guilty, don't you?" Father Brown didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the fireplace, studying the embers that still glowed faintly. "I think," he said slowly, "that the truth is rarely as clean as we wish it to be. And I think you've spent your whole life trying to hide from it. The truth about your husband. The truth about yourself." She spun around, her eyes flashing now, a mixture of anger and something else. Fear, perhaps, or regret. "You don't understand. He would have ruined everything. I had to stop him before he destroyed me too." Father Brown's gaze remained steady. "The only person your husband was capable of destroying was himself. You didn't stop him, Evelyn. You helped him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice small, trembling with the weight of everything she had kept buried for so long. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't know he was going to take it that far. But he did. And now it's too late." Father Brown nodded, understanding more than she realized. "It's never too late, Evelyn. Not for confession. Not for redemption." Her eyes were filled with tears now, but there was no more manipulation in them, only the hollow ache of someone who had carried the burden of guilt for far too long. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Brown didn't hesitate. "I can. But you have to help yourself first. Confess what you've done. To me. To God." She looked away, and for a moment, Father Brown wasn't sure if she would speak. But then, slowly, she nodded. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't let him destroy me, so I ended it. But I didn't mean for it to end this way. I didn't mean for him to die." Father Brown placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his voice soft. "The truth will set you free, Evelyn. But first, you must face it." As she broke down, Father Brown turned and walked out of the room, the weight of her confession heavy in the air. Outside, the rain still fell, washing the city clean, but it could never wash away the truth. Father Brown knew that the world would never be free of sin, but sometimes the smallest light, like the one flickering in the darkness beneath the lamplight cross, was enough to lead someone back to redemption. Chapter 6. Ashes in the Font. The rain had long since soaked the streets into a slick canvas of shadows and reflections. It was the kind of night that crept through the bones, numbing the world to its most primal truths. The city wasn't any more alive tonight than it had been yesterday, but it was angry, alive with the kind of resentment that followed the sting of betrayal. The neon lights flickered like ghosts of promises once made. The bars were full, the alleyways silent except for the low murmur of men who couldn't look each other in the eye. And Father Brown moved through it all as if he had no part in it, though he knew better. Tonight he had been called to the most sacred of places, St. Dominic's. The old church sat on the corner, worn but proud, its stone facade marked by years of rain and regret. The font at the entrance was empty, save for the fine dust that had settled in it like old ashes. It hadn't seen water in years, and Father Brown couldn't help but think it was fitting. For what had once been a holy place had become little more than a reminder of how far the city had fallen. A letter had come to him earlier that day, this time a strange one. No name, just a hastily scrawled message. "Come to the church. The font holds more than water now." Father Brown had read the words twice, then folded the note carefully. He hadn't expected much from the anonymous plea, but something about it gnawed at him. The city had a way of dragging people into dark corners, and the people who lived in those corners often needed someone who could see in the dark. He entered the church through the side door, the creaking sound of the old wood barely audible over the distant hum of the streetlights. The church smelled of incense long burnt out and dust too thick to stir. The candles on the altar had long since gone out, leaving only shadows to light the way. But Father Brown wasn't afraid of shadows. It was the light he feared, because where there was light, there was always something to hide. The woman was waiting for him by the font, her silhouette dark against the dim flicker of the stained glass windows. She wore a black coat, the edges frayed as if it had been worn too many times in the wrong places. Her hair was pinned up neatly, but even in the dim light, Father Brown could see the thin sheen of sweat on her brow, the kind of sheen that came not from exertion, but from the cold, crawling panic that dug into the soul. "You came," she said, her voice strained, as though it had been cracked by too many secrets. She didn't turn to look at him, but stood with her back to him, her eyes fixed on the empty font. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here," Father Brown said, his voice quiet, almost like a murmur against the stillness. "What's troubling you?" She turned, her face pale, framed by the same dissonant look of a woman who had lost something and couldn't find it again. She looked at him for a moment, then spoke, her words coming out in a rush. "My husband, he's gone, and I don't know what happened." Father Brown's gaze didn't waver, but something in her words made him pause. There was a tremor in her voice, a careful blend of desperation and guilt. She was hiding something, and he knew it. But there was something else there too, something that didn't belong to a grieving widow. "Your husband?" Father Brown asked, stepping closer to her. "What is his name?" "Victor Quinn." She paused, biting her lip before continuing. "He was a well-known man, an entrepreneur. He built half the city's businesses, but his past—" She shook her head. "I never knew it was this dark." "What do you mean?" Father Brown asked, his voice a low, even whisper. She glanced down at the font, and Father Brown saw the tears welling in her eyes. "He had enemies, Father, people who would do anything to destroy him, but not just business rivals. He was involved with dangerous men, people who didn't mind using their power for more than just money." "And you think one of these enemies is responsible for his disappearance?" Father Brown asked. She nodded, her hands trembling now, though she kept them clasped tightly together. "I don't know, but I've heard things, terrible things. He's gone, Father, and I'm afraid it's my fault." Father Brown remained still for a moment. His eyes were sharp, noticing the way her fingers twitched, the slight stutter in her breath. She wasn't just worried about her husband's disappearance. There was something much deeper at play. "You think this is your fault because of what he was involved in?" Father Brown asked. "I think it's my fault because I knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he was hiding things, and I helped him." Father Brown stepped forward, his voice calm and deliberate. "And what is it you think you've helped him hide?" She glanced up at him, then quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid his gaze. "I've done things, Father, things I'm not proud of. I thought I was helping him, keeping the people who wanted to hurt him at bay. But now—" She wiped her eyes quickly. "Now I think I've made it worse, much worse." Father Brown could hear the crack in her voice, the guilt bleeding through the cracks of her composure. It wasn't just fear of what had happened to her husband, it was fear of what she had done. She had been complicit in something dark, and now it had come back to collect its due. "Tell me what happened," Father Brown said softly. She swallowed, then nodded, her eyes distant as she spoke. "Victor had an affair with a woman named Maria, a woman from his past. I found out about it a few months ago. I didn't say anything to him, but I couldn't just ignore it, so I found out more about her. I paid someone to follow her, to dig into her life, and that's when I found something terrible." "What did you find?" Father Brown asked, his voice steady. She hesitated again, then looked directly at him. "Maria was connected to some very dangerous people, people who didn't care about loyalty or relationships. They cared only about power and control." Father Brown's gaze softened slightly, though his mind raced through the details. "What did your husband's enemies want?" She closed her eyes, her lips trembling. "They wanted him to give up his businesses, to sell everything he had worked for. And he refused. That's why I think they took him. I think they used Maria to get to him. She had the leverage to make him do what they wanted. And when he didn't—" "Is that when you think they killed him?" Father Brown asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think he's dead. But I think they took him, and I think it's my fault. Father Brown took a step back, watching her carefully. There was a sickness in her words, something that ran deeper than just fear for her husband. There was guilt, yes, but also a confession without words. She wasn't afraid of losing him. She was afraid of what she had helped him do. "Where is he now?" Father Brown asked quietly. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just know that he's somewhere close, somewhere safe for now. But he's trapped, Father, and so am I. The longer I stay here, the more I know they'll come for me too." Father Brown regarded her quietly, then looked down at the font, empty as it had always been. But now it felt different, as though it was waiting for something more than just holy water. It had been used for baptisms, but tonight it felt like a grave. Her confession was like the ashes that lingered there, something that should have been washed away, but was left behind, clinging to the stone. "Do you want to save yourself, Evelyn?" Father Brown asked softly. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Do you want to save yourself from this?" Father Brown asked again. "Or are you willing to let the darkness continue to consume you?" She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since their conversation had begun, Father Brown saw something real in her eyes, something raw, not fear, but a recognition of her own sin. "I'll do anything," she whispered. Father Brown nodded, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then you need to confess it all, every lie, every secret. Only then will you begin to understand what you've really done." Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her hands clasped together, her sobs filling the silence of the church. Father Brown stepped back, his mind already working, already preparing for the next step. This case wasn't just about finding a missing man. It was about finding the truth, hidden beneath layers of guilt, manipulation, and fear. As the rain continued to pour outside, Father Brown stood still, knowing that the font would be filled again. This time not with water, but with the ashes of a confession long overdue. Chapter 7. The bell tolls twice. The rain fell with a grim determination, an endless drumbeat on the slick streets of the city. The sky was a sheet of grey, and the neon lights reflected off the puddles in wild, distorted colors that made the streets look like a cheap carnival ride, a mockery of a world that had long since abandoned innocence. A saxophone moaned in the distance, its sound barely audible over the hum of the city's engine. Cars, people, secrets. Father Brown walked slowly, his worn shoes making little sound against the wet pavement. His coat was soaked at the hem, the collar pulled up against the wind, but he didn't seem to mind. He was used to the rain, used to the noise, the lies, and the darkness. It was all part of the same world, a world where shadows were more comfortable than light, and where people with secrets went to great lengths to keep them hidden. The bell tolled once, the heavy sound echoing in the night air, and Father Brown couldn't help but wonder if it had been meant for him. The note had come just after dusk, an unsigned letter left on the steps of St. Dominic's, its yellowed paper crinkled from the rain. It had been short, blunt, and to the point. "Come to the old church on 5th at midnight. The bell tolls twice." Father Brown knew the church. It had been a part of the city's skyline for decades, a place where the lost and the damned could find solace. Or so they hoped. But like everything in the city, the church had its own skeletons, and its bell was no different. The bell had a history, a reputation for marking more than just the hours. There were rumors about it, about the people who had vanished when it told. But Father Brown had learned not to believe in rumors. He would find out for himself. By the time he reached the church, the streets had grown even quieter, the rain now more of a mist than a downpour. The church stood like a monument to something forgotten, its facade cracked and chipped, its stained glass windows dimmed by years of neglect. The bell tower loomed over the city, silent for the moment, but Father Brown knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had learned a long time ago that silence was often the prelude to something worse. Inside, the church smelled like incense and decay, the air thick with the weight of unanswered prayers. A single light flickered above the altar, casting long shadows across the pews. There was no one there, no one except for a woman standing near the front of the church, her back to him. She was tall, draped in black, the hem of her dress pooling on the floor like a shadow of its own. Her hair was pinned up in a tight knot, and even from the back, Father Brown could tell that her posture was perfect, stiff, as though she had been waiting for a very long time. She didn't turn when he entered, but she spoke, her voice low and controlled. "You came." Father Brown stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the old carpet beneath his feet. "I did," he said softly. "And you are?" "Veronica Delaney," she said, turning at last. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, assessing him with a calculating look that sent a small shiver down his spine. There was something about her, something that didn't belong in a place like this. "I've been waiting for you, Father." Father Brown nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "What do you need, Mrs. Delaney?" "I need you to find my husband," she said, her voice steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. "He's gone, disappeared. I think something terrible has happened to him." Father Brown didn't flinch. He had seen too many desperate people, too many who had lost someone they loved, to be fooled by her composed exterior. There was something more to this woman, something hidden beneath her calm facade. But what exactly it was, he couldn't yet say. "Your husband?" he asked, stepping closer. "What is his name?" "James Delaney," she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she expected him to know the name already. "He was well known in certain circles, a businessman, a man of influence. But now he's gone." Father Brown's mind moved quickly, like a machine clicking into gear. A man of influence, a businessman with ties to the underbelly of the city, the kind of man who didn't just vanish without leaving a trace. "And what makes you think something terrible has happened to him?" he asked. She hesitated, her lips tightening before she spoke again. "The bell." "The bell?" Father Brown echoed, his eyebrow arching slightly. She nodded, her eyes flickering briefly to the tower above. "The bell tolls twice. It always has. But this time, it tolled once. And I know what it means." Father Brown stepped back, considering her words. There was something about her, about the way she said it, that made him pause. She wasn't speaking like a grieving wife. She was speaking like someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. And he had a feeling she wasn't just talking about the bell. "I see," he said quietly. "And what does it mean?" She hesitated, then took a step toward him, lowering her voice. "It means that James is dead, and whoever killed him is still here." Father Brown's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think I can find the killer?" "I think you can find the truth," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "I don't care about the killer. I care about the truth, and I know that you can find it." Father Brown studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I will find the truth. But first, I need to know more about your husband. What kind of man was he? She hesitated again, her lips trembling for the briefest moment before she answered. James was ambitious, too ambitious. He wanted more power, more control. He made deals with people who weren't exactly upstanding. There were rumors, Father, rumors about his business dealings, about the things he had done to get where he was. Father Brown listened, his expression unreadable, as she spoke of her husband's darker side, the side that no one spoke about in polite company. But it wasn't just the rumors that bothered him. It was the way she spoke of him. There was a detachment in her voice, a coldness that didn't belong to someone who had lost a spouse. It made him wonder whether she was mourning James Delaney at all, or if she was mourning something else entirely. You said your husband was involved in dealings, Father Brown said, his voice calm but probing. What kind of dealings? She bit her lip, as though deciding how much to reveal. The kind of dealings that don't end well for everyone involved, she said, her voice dropping lower. James made enemies, powerful ones. And you think they killed him? Father Brown asked. I think they took him, she replied, her eyes growing darker. And I think they will come for me too, because I know things. Father Brown stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her face. You know things. I know what he was involved in, she said, her voice shaking now. I know what he was hiding, and I think they know I know. They'll come for me, Father. They'll come for all of us. Father Brown stood still for a long moment, considering her words. There was fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that didn't add up. He had seen it in people before, the way they looked at you when they were hiding something, when they were trying to manipulate you. And Veronica Delaney was trying to manipulate him. She wasn't just a grieving wife, she was a woman with a secret. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she stood, in the way she spoke. She wasn't afraid of losing her husband. She was afraid of losing herself. Mrs. Delaney, Father Brown said, his voice steady, I will help you find the truth. But first, you must tell me everything. All of it. For a long moment she said nothing, her gaze never leaving his. Then, finally, she spoke. James was a man who thought he could escape his past, but his past caught up with him, and now it's my turn. Father Brown nodded slowly. I understand. But what he didn't say, what he knew deep down, was that the truth was far more complicated than either of them could imagine. And whatever had happened to James Delaney, it had started long before that bell tolled. As the bell rang twice, its sound reverberating through the night, Father Brown turned and walked out of the church, his mind racing with the weight of the words that had been spoken. The city was full of secrets, and somewhere in its dark heart, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. But it would take more than just a confession to set things right. It would take facing the darkness that lurked in the souls of those who thought they could outrun their sins. And Father Brown knew that in this city, no one could outrun the truth forever. Chapter 8. Voices Behind the Curtain. The rain didn't stop falling that night. It never did. Not in this city, not where the streets were paved with secrets, and every corner turned, held the promise of something dark, waiting in the shadows. The neon lights flickered weakly, casting a sickly glow that turned everything into a washed-out painting of a place that never quite felt alive. Cars skidded past, their tires slicing through the rain-soaked streets, leaving streaks of red and yellow in their wake. But there was no music in the air, only the distant sound of a saxophone moaning somewhere in a smoky bar, where the air was thick with the weight of old regrets and unspoken truths. Father Brown walked through the streets like a man who didn't belong, though he'd been here long enough to know better. His black coat was soaked at the edges, the collar pulled up against the wind, and his footsteps echoed quietly on the wet pavement. There was something about the night that made the world feel smaller, tighter, as though the city was slowly closing in on itself, and everyone who lived in it was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable to happen. A note had come to him earlier that day, delivered under the door of St. Dominic's, just as the sun was dipping below the skyline. No name, no address, just a single line of ink scrawled on a torn piece of paper. Meet me behind the curtain at midnight. The truth lies within. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to pull him into something messy, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was something about the words, something cold in the way they had been written, that made him pause. The truth, it seemed, was always hiding somewhere, and it was always buried deeper than most people cared to look. He reached the address just as the clock in the distance struck midnight. It was an old theater, tucked away between two crumbling buildings, the kind of place where the audience had long since stopped caring about what was on stage, and the actors had stopped pretending. The marquee was half lit, the letters spelling out something incomprehensible in a language no one bothered to read anymore. The door was cracked open just enough for him to slip inside, and when he did, the first thing he noticed was the smell: musty velvet, stale smoke, and something else that hung in the air like a forgotten prayer. There was no one in the lobby. No ushers, no ticket takers, just shadows stretching across the cracked floors and faded posters of plays that hadn't been performed in decades. Father Brown's eyes moved toward the stage, toward the heavy curtains that hung like a veil between the world outside and the one within. A dim light spilled from behind them, and for a moment, it was the only thing in the room that seemed real. He stepped forward, his shoes making little sound as they touched the dusty floor. He didn't need to be told where to go. He had been here before, in a different life, in a different city. A voice, barely a whisper, cut through the silence. "Father Brown," it said. The voice was low, familiar, but there was a tension in it, a sharpness that didn't belong. "You came." He paused, his hand resting on the edge of the stage. "I came, but I'm not sure why." From behind the curtain, a figure stepped forward, cloaked in darkness, her face hidden in shadow. She was tall, her silhouette sharp against the dim light, her presence commanding and unmistakable. The woman who stood before him was no stranger. He had seen her in the streets, in the alleys, in the bars, where men traded secrets with their drinks. She had a name, a reputation. Her name was Eliza Doretti, and if there was one thing that could be said about her, it was that she had a way of making people think they were in control, when in reality, she was the one pulling the strings. "I wasn't sure you would," Eliza said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Most people would have stayed away, but not you." Father Brown didn't answer right away. He wasn't interested in playing her game, not yet. Instead, he studied her with quiet precision, taking in the way she stood, the way her eyes flickered beneath the brim of her hat. She wasn't just hiding her face. She was hiding something else, something far more dangerous. "You wanted to see me," Father Brown said finally. "What is it you want from me?" Her lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold calculation of a woman who knew how to get what she wanted. "I want you to find someone," she said. "A man named Vincent Croft. He's gone missing, and I need you to bring him back." Father Brown's brow furrowed slightly. Vincent Croft? He repeated the name, testing it on his tongue. I've heard of him. Of course you have, Eliza said, stepping closer, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Everyone has. He's a lawyer, a fixer, the kind of man who can make things disappear, if the price is right. Father Brown nodded slowly. He knew the type. Vincent Croft wasn't a man who made friends easily, but he made enemies with terrifying efficiency. And in a city like this, with its crooked cops and its endless underworld, there was only one rule. If you weren't careful, your enemies would swallow you whole. And you think he's in trouble? Father Brown asked. Eliza's expression hardened. I think he's in over his head. The last time I saw him, he was different, nervous, frantic. He said something about needing to disappear. And then he vanished. Father Brown took a step back, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. There was more to this story than Eliza was letting on. He could feel it, a faint tremor in the air, a tugging at the edges of her words that made him wonder if she wasn't asking for help at all. Perhaps she was asking for something else. Perhaps she had a hand in whatever had happened to Vincent Croft. You've been hiding something, Father Brown said quietly, his eyes fixed on her face. I can see it, and I think you're not just here to ask for help. For the first time, Eliza flinched. It was a small movement, a brief twitch of her fingers, but it was enough. Father Brown had seen it before, the way people gave themselves away when they thought they were still in control. Eliza wasn't afraid of losing Vincent Croft. She was afraid of losing something much more valuable. I don't know what you mean, she said quickly, but her voice wavered. You know exactly what I mean, Father Brown replied. You came to me because you think I can untangle the mess you've made, but you're not fooling me. You're not just looking for Vincent Croft. You're looking for a way out. Eliza took a step back, her hands trembling at her sides. You don't know anything about it, Father. I know more than you think, Father Brown said. I know that Vincent Croft didn't disappear because of his enemies. He disappeared because of his allies. He knew too much about the people who would use him. He crossed a line. She swallowed, her gaze flickering away. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. He was dangerous, and he was going to destroy everything. Everything, Father Brown repeated, his tone soft but firm. That's always the excuse, isn't it? We destroy what we can't control. But you're forgetting something important. What's that? Eliza asked, her voice low. The truth doesn't care about your excuses, Father Brown said quietly. And neither do I. For a long moment, Eliza didn't move. The only sound in the room was the distant hum of the city outside, the slow rhythm of its heartbeat. And then finally, she spoke. You're right, she said, her voice almost breaking. Vincent was going to expose everything, the corruption, the lies. He knew too much about what we've done, and I couldn't let that happen. Father Brown nodded slowly. And now, you want me to clean up your mess. Eliza's gaze met his, her eyes wide, searching. Please, you have to help me. I can't do this on my own. Father Brown stood still for a moment, his hands folded in front of him, his mind working through the layers of deception and fear that had brought them both to this point. Eliza had tried to manipulate him, to play him like one of her pawns, but she had underestimated him. She had underestimated the one thing that always found its way to the surface. Truth. Tell me where he is, Father Brown said, and I will bring him back. But know this, Eliza. The truth is a dangerous thing, And once it's out in the open, there's no going back. For the first time that night, Eliza's mask cracked, her shoulders slumped, and she finally spoke the words she had been avoiding. Behind the curtain, she whispered, "He's there." Father Brown turned toward the stage, toward the heavy curtains that had hidden the truth from him. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the fabric. The curtain parted easily, revealing the shadows beyond. And in those shadows, there was Vincent Croft, alive but broken. The game was over. The curtain had fallen, and the voices behind it had been exposed. Father Brown knew the truth now. It was never about finding Vincent Croft. It was about finding the sin that had made everything fall apart. And now, there was nothing left to do but watch the pieces crumble. Chapter 9. A Glove in the Gutter. The rain was heavier than it had been in days, streaking the glass of Father Brown's spectacles and soaking the brim of his hat. The streets were slick, reflecting the cold gleam of neon signs that hummed like they had something to say. In a city like this, those signs always spoke the same language: lies, promises, and empty chances. Father Brown knew them all too well. He had seen enough to know that when a city forgot how to dream, it began to sleepwalk, carefully, in silence, and with an insidious kind of purpose. The note had come just after noon, a crumpled slip of paper with no return address and just a few hastily written words. "Meet me at the corner bar. I need you to find something important. Don't bring the police." It was the kind of message that usually meant trouble. But Father Brown had dealt with trouble all his life, and it rarely managed to keep him from uncovering the truth. By the time he made it to the bar, the night had settled in, like a heavy coat. The corner bar stood on the edge of a forgotten street, its cracked windows dimly glowing from the inside. The door squeaked open, letting out a puff of warm air that smelled of tobacco smoke, stale beer, and broken dreams. Father Brown stepped in, wiping his shoes on the rug at the door as he took in the scene. The usual clientele, broken men in fedoras, women with eyes like they'd seen too much, occupied the scattered tables, nursing drinks and their regrets. At the bar, a woman with short, jet-black hair and a face that hadn't smiled in years stood talking to the bartender, her voice low but firm. She was dressed in a tight black dress that clung to her form like the city clung to its sins, her posture elegant but guarded. She didn't look up when Father Brown entered, but she knew he was there the moment he stepped inside. "You're Father Brown, I presume." Her voice was sharp, carrying the kind of authority that made it clear she wasn't used to being ignored. "I am," Father Brown said, simply, his eyes scanning the room, though he never lingered too long on any one face. There was something about the woman that he couldn't quite place. "And you are?" "Patricia Denham," she said, her eyes finally meeting his. "But you already knew that. I need your help, Father." Father Brown folded his hands and waited. He wasn't a man who rushed into things. "What is it that you need help with?" She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her handbag and placed a small blood-stained glove on the bar. The leather was soft, the kind of material that spoke of wealth and care. But it was the stain that caught his attention. Dark and sharp, it didn't look like something accidental. "I need you to find out who this belongs to," Patricia said, her voice steady but strained. "And I need you to find them before anyone else does." Father Brown didn't reach for the glove. He wasn't the sort to be moved by the obvious. "A glove?" he asked, his voice even, though his mind was already working. Why would I need to find out who it belongs to? Patricia's expression tightened, her lips pressed together in something between frustration and fear. It's not just a glove. It's a message, and I'm afraid that whoever sent it will send more. Worse than this. Father Brown nodded slowly, his gaze still on the glove. He wasn't a man given to intuition, but there were signs. The way she handled it, the tremor in her voice, the bloodstain. She wasn't telling him everything. But then again, most people never did. He had learned to read between the lines, and it wasn't the first time someone had tried to manipulate him into solving a problem that wasn't as simple as it seemed. "You want me to find someone," Father Brown said quietly. "But you're hiding something, aren't you? Something about this glove. Something about why it's so important." Her eyes darted away for a moment, a flicker of something, guilt, before she spoke again. "My husband, Edmund Denham, he's gone missing. 2 days now. No one knows where he is. But I know he's in trouble. This glove, it's all that's left behind. I think he's been taken." Father Brown raised an eyebrow. "Taken by whom?" "By someone dangerous," she replied. "Edmund wasn't just a businessman. He was a lawyer too. He knew people, the kind of people who don't take kindly to being crossed. And I think he did something he shouldn't have. He made promises he couldn't keep." "I see," Father Brown said, his eyes softening slightly. He knew the type. Men who thought their words could shield them from the consequences of their actions. Men who believed that power could be bought and sold, like anything else. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone like Edmund Denham. "And you think this is connected to his disappearance?" "I know it is," she said, a tremor in her voice now. "But there's more. Edmund was mixed up in something that involved the wrong people. I don't know who they are, but I'm sure of one thing. If I don't find him first, they'll find me, and I won't be able to stop them." Father Brown studied her for a long moment, his mind turning over the details she had given him. There was fear in her eyes, but it was the kind of fear that came with knowing you had no choice. It wasn't a fear of the unknown. It was a fear of facing the consequences of a choice made long ago. "You've been hiding something," Father Brown said again, his voice quiet but insistent. "And I think I know what it is." Patricia stiffened. "What are you talking about?" "You're not here because you want to find your husband," Father Brown said, his tone unwavering. "You're here because you want to protect yourself. You've done something that ties you to his disappearance. And now you're afraid of what's going to happen next." Her face twisted, her hands tightening around her handbag. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm just trying to save my husband." "No," Father Brown said softly. "You're trying to save yourself, and you're using me to do it." She fell silent, her eyes flashing with a mixture of rage and fear. She knew he was right, but she wasn't about to admit it. "I think it's time you told me the truth, Patricia," Father Brown said, "and I think it's time you stopped hiding behind your lies." She hesitated for a moment, then looked away, her shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the truth was too much to carry. "Edmund, he was involved with the wrong people," she said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know how deep it went. I thought I could control it, but I couldn't. And now I'm scared." Father Brown didn't say anything for a long moment. He was used to people coming to him with half-truths, with stories that didn't add up. But he was also used to seeing the fear behind the words, the fear of something far worse than whatever crime had been committed. And Patricia Denham was afraid of the men who had taken her husband, but more afraid of the part she had played in it. "Who are these men, Patricia?" Father Brown asked. "And why are they coming for you?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something dark, something that hadn't been there before. "They're the ones Edmund crossed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're the ones who made him promise what he couldn't deliver. And now they're coming for me." Father Brown didn't need her to say more. He already knew enough. The glove in the gutter wasn't just a clue. It was a message, a warning to someone who had gone too far, someone who had made the mistake of thinking they could play with the lives of others without paying the price. And Patricia Denham was right about one thing. If she didn't find her husband first, someone else would. "Where is he, Patricia?" Father Brown asked. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I found this in his office. It's the only thing that makes sense. It's where he's hiding, or where he was hiding." Father Brown took the paper, unfolded it, and scanned the contents. It was a map. No street names, just a series of symbols that led to a building on the outskirts of the city, a place he knew well. It was a warehouse, one that had long since been abandoned, its windows boarded up, its doors rusted shut. But it was still standing, and in a city like this, that was all that mattered. He looked up at Patricia, his expression steady. "I'll go there," he said. "I'll find your husband. But if I do this, Patricia, you have to promise me something." "What?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You have to promise me that when this is all over, you'll face the truth. All of it." She hesitated, then nodded slowly, her lips pressed tightly together. Father Brown turned toward the door, his coat swirling around his ankles. The rain still fell in, sheets, but it didn't matter. He had found what he was looking for. The glove in the gutter was more than just a clue. It was the first piece of a puzzle that only one person could solve. The truth. It was always the last thing people wanted to face. But in a city like this, it was the only thing that could save them. Chapter 10. The Angel Behind Bars. The city had a way of swallowing its own, of turning the most hopeful of places into shadows, of making light seem so foreign that the only way you knew it had ever existed was by the cold echo of it bouncing off the broken glass of a forgotten street lamp. The rain had stopped for a few hours, but the pavement was still slick, and the air was thick with a damp, suffocating chill. The kind of night that made even the hardest men hesitate, not out of fear, but out of that creeping realization that they were never in control. Father Brown walked through the mist, his coat pulled tight, his hat low over his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd walked these streets, and it wouldn't be the last. He'd seen the darkness that lurked in places like these, the kind of filth that settled into the bones of a city, the kind of sin that you couldn't wash away with money or power. But Father Brown wasn't here to fight the city. He wasn't here to bring it to its knees. He was here to understand it, to peel back the layers, to find the hearts of those who thought they could hide. The call had come late. Another unsigned letter, no return address. This time, it was shorter than most. "She's been framed. Find her, Father, before the truth gets buried." Beneath the note was a name, Angelica Voss. It didn't mean anything to him at first, but in a city like this, names rarely did. It was the story behind them that mattered, the weight they carried. He had followed the note to a small, inconspicuous building on the far side of the city, a place that looked more like an old office building than anything else, the kind of place where people made deals behind closed doors, where the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. The door creaked as Father Brown pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke. The kind of place where promises were made but never kept. Woman sat at a desk, her face partially obscured by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Her hair was dark, pinned back in a way that made it look like she had tried too hard to look elegant. She wore a black dress that seemed to cling to her skin, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, watched him as he entered. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked like she had been waiting for him. "You're Father Brown," she said, her voice low and measured, like someone who had learned to control it. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I came," Father Brown said, his voice steady, almost tired. "And I'm here to help." The woman's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Help? You don't even know what I need help with." "I don't need to know," Father Brown replied, his gaze steady on her. "I can tell by your eyes. You need someone to find the truth, and I'm the only one left who still believes it's worth finding." Her eyes flickered just for a moment, but in that brief flash, Father Brown saw something that confirmed what he already knew. She wasn't just a victim in this. She was a player. She wasn't here to find help. She was here to manipulate. "I'm Angelica Voss," she said, her voice gaining strength now, as though she had prepared herself for whatever came next. "And I need you to prove my innocence." Father Brown raised an eyebrow, taking a step closer to her. "Innocence? What have you done that needs proving?" Angelica's face hardened. "I've been accused of a crime I didn't commit. I'm being framed. I know who did it, and I need you to clear my name before the police get involved." Father Brown tilted his head slightly, studying her. He wasn't buying it. Not yet. "A crime, you say? What kind of crime?" "It's a murder," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing as if the weight of the words had finally hit her. "A man named Henry Grayson. He was killed, and everyone believes I did it. They think I'm guilty because of my past. They think I have something to gain from it." Father Brown stood silently for a moment, considering her words. Murder wasn't something to be taken lightly, and yet there was something in the way she said it, something that made him doubt the simplicity of her story. "Why would anyone think you killed him?" Father Brown asked. "Because I was the last person to see him alive," she said, her voice hardening. "And because Grayson and I had a history that isn't as clean as I'd like it to be. But I didn't kill him, Father. I didn't." Father Brown let the silence stretch between them, his mind sifting through the possibilities. He had heard stories like this before. The wronged woman, the accidental lover, the framed criminal, and every time, the truth was buried beneath layers of lies and half-truths. He had learned long ago that in cases like this, it wasn't the crime that mattered. It was the sin. "And why," Father Brown said, "do you think you're being framed? What's the reason someone would want to make you the fall person?" Angelica's eyes darkened. "Because I'm in the way. I've been trying to take control of my husband's company. He left it to me when he died. But there are people, men, who don't like a woman in power. They've been trying to get me out of the picture for years. And now that Henry Grayson is dead, they're using it as an opportunity." "So you think someone is using his death to remove you from your position?" Father Brown said, his voice calm, but his mind working quickly. "Who are these men?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense now. "They're businessmen, powerful. They've been in control of my company for far too long. They were afraid I'd come for what's mine. Grayson was their inside man. He was working with them to keep me under their thumb. Father Brown nodded slowly, his mind connecting the dots. And now they want you out of the picture, one way or another. Yes, she said, her voice sharp. And they'll stop at nothing. They've already framed me for murder. If you don't help me, Father, they'll make sure I go to prison. Father Brown looked at her for a long moment, considering everything she had said. The story had all the hallmarks of a classic setup. The woman, the powerful men, the crime that seemed to have no clear motive. But there was something that didn't add up, something that didn't sit right with him. He had learned that when something feels off, it usually is. I'll help you, Father Brown said, his voice quiet but firm. But I need to ask you something first. What aren't you telling me? Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. Then she looked away. Nothing. Father Brown didn't flinch. The truth doesn't hide, Angelica. Not for long. Her expression faltered, and then she broke. I lied, she whispered. I didn't just find him. I had an affair with Henry Grayson. He was going to leave his wife for me. I thought I could have it all. His money, his power, everything. But he was going to turn on me. He was going to expose everything, including the way I had gotten control of the company. He was going to ruin me. Father Brown remained still, waiting for her to continue. I didn't kill him, she said quickly, as though the words were tearing themselves out of her. But I wanted him to stay quiet. I wanted him to stay with me, to help me keep everything I had fought for. I couldn't let him ruin it all. But I swear, Father, I didn't kill him. Father Brown took a slow breath. He had heard enough to know the truth. The truth wasn't about the murder. It was about the lies that had led them all here. Angelica hadn't just been framed. She had helped frame herself. The bell tolled somewhere in the distance, faint but clear. In a city like this, you didn't need to hear it to know what it meant. The sins of the past always came back to claim their due. Father Brown turned to her, his gaze steady. The truth, Angelica, is that you didn't just want power. You wanted control. And that desire led you down a path you couldn't turn back from. She looked at him, her face pale, as if the weight of his words had just hit her. What do I do now? You face the truth, Father Brown said softly, and you let it set you free. Angelica's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time, she looked like she was starting to understand. Father Brown didn't need to solve the crime for her. She had already done it herself. It was never about the crime. It was always about the sin. And in the end, it was always the sin that had to be faced. Chapter 11. Sin in the Silence. The rain didn't stop that night. Not that it ever did in this city. The streets were slick and wet, and every flicker of the neon signs painted the pavement with a blur of colors, like a promise no one believed anymore. Father Brown's footsteps echoed softly against the damp ground, the only sound in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of quiet. He had learned to listen to the silence. It spoke louder than any noise, telling you things people would never say. The silence in this city was always the same, thick, heavy, pregnant with secrets. The call had come just as the sun was sinking behind the skyline. A cheap phone call, the kind that crackled on the line and felt like a bad omen. No name, no return number, just a voice. A woman's voice, telling him that she needed his help. Meet me at the old club. I have something you need to hear. You won't regret it. The voice had trembled just enough for him to take the message seriously. Father Brown hadn't hesitated. He didn't question calls like that. He knew the darkness of the city well, and in a place like this, the things people buried were only waiting to crawl out. He had seen enough to know that wherever there was a whisper in the dark, there was a lie being told. And where there was a lie, there was always someone who needed help uncovering the truth. The club sat at the corner of an alley, its sign half lit by a flickering bulb that hummed like it wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. It was the kind of place that used to be full of music and laughter, but now it only served as a reminder of better times, long gone. The windows were dark, the door cracked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. Father Brown stepped inside, his coat heavy with the rain, his hat low on his head. He didn't need to see the room. He could feel it, the stale air, the stale lives, the kind of place where the sins of the past stacked up like the bottles on the bar. She was sitting at a table in the back, a cigarette dangling from her fingers, the smoke curling up in delicate tendrils that disappeared into the air like the ghosts of people who had once thought they could escape. She didn't look like much, tall, with dark hair and a face that had been beautiful once, but now seemed worn by too many years spent watching people disappear. But there was something about her that made Father Brown stop for a moment. It wasn't her beauty, it was her eyes, sharp, calculating, and hiding something she wasn't ready to admit. "You came," she said, when he approached, her voice soft, but there was an edge to it that made it clear she wasn't used to being ignored. "I wasn't sure you would." "I came," Father Brown said, his voice calm, his gaze steady. "And you are?" Clara Devlin." She took a drag from her cigarette, her eyes never leaving him. "I'm in trouble, Father, and I need your help." Father Brown sat down across from her, folding his hands in front of him. "What kind of trouble?" She exhaled slowly, the smoke drifting between them like a veil. "It's my husband, Jack Devlin. He's gone missing, and the police, they don't care. They say it's just another case of someone walking away. But I know better. I know Jack's not just gone. He's been taken." Father Brown watched her carefully. There was no panic in her voice, no desperation, just a quiet certainty that told him she knew exactly what she was talking about. "You think he's been kidnapped?" Clara looked down at the table, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the wood. "Not kidnapped, taken. Jack was in deep, Father. Real deep. He was mixed up with some bad people, dangerous people, and now they're looking for something. And I think Jack knew too much, enough to get him killed." Father Brown didn't answer right away. He could see the pieces of the puzzle starting to form, but there was something else, a hesitation in her voice, a hint of guilt that she couldn't quite hide. He had learned long ago that people weren't always as innocent as they claimed to be, and in a city like this, there was always more than one side to every story. "Who are these people?" Father Brown asked. Clara's gaze flickered for a moment, and for the first time, he saw a shadow of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or something darker. "I don't know. I think they were working with Jack, but I'm not sure. I never asked too many questions." "Why didn't you?" She looked at him then, her eyes narrowing as if he had just asked her the most obvious question in the world. "Because I didn't want to know. Jack always told me that he was protecting me, keeping me out of it, and I believed him. But now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Father Brown nodded slowly, his mind piecing the story together. "And now you want me to find him." "I want you to find out what happened to him," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want you to find the truth." Father Brown sat back, his fingers steepled in front of his lips. The whole thing smelled like a setup. The missing husband, the mysterious enemies, the half-truths. Clara Devlin wasn't just here to ask for help. She was trying to manipulate him, to lead him down a path where he would uncover a truth that suited her. The problem was, Father Brown wasn't fooled easily. He had learned long ago that the truth wasn't always about solving crimes. It was about understanding the people behind them. "Where do I start, Father?" Brown asked, his voice quiet but probing. Clara hesitated. "I don't know," she said, her voice small now. "I thought if I came to you, you might be able to see something I couldn't. Maybe you could find something, anything, that could explain where he went." Father Brown stood up, his coat falling open as he made his way toward the door. "I'll need to see his office, the place where he worked." Clara's eyes widened. "You'll go there?" "I'll go where I need to go," Father Brown said, his voice calm. "But I need you to trust me. If you want the truth, I have to see everything." She stood up then, her hands clasped tightly together, the nervousness in her eyes betraying her calm demeanor. "I trust you, Father, but please, hurry." The office was just as Father Brown expected, dim, cluttered, and filled with the scent of old paper and cigarette smoke. Jack Devlin's desk was cluttered with files, papers, and photographs, some of which had been hastily shoved into drawers as if someone had been trying to hide something. Father Brown carefully flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning each one with the practiced ease of someone who had seen more than his fair share of secrets. The room told a story about a man who had lived a double life, a man who had been playing with fire for far too long. There were mentions of deals, names of men who had long since stopped caring about the law, and a series of numbers that meant something. But Father Brown wasn't sure what yet. And then, in a drawer near the back of the desk, he found it. A small, black notebook, its pages filled with names and dates, along with a single phrase written in bold letters at the top, "The Angel's Debt." Father Brown turned the page slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. There were names, men, women, each one tied to some transaction, some debt, some favor. But at the end of the list, written in a shaky hand, was a name that sent a chill through him. Clara Devlin. It wasn't just her husband who was tangled in this mess. It was her, too. Father Brown closed the notebook and turned to face Clara, who had followed him into the room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. "You knew about the debts, didn't you?" Father Brown asked softly, his gaze steady on her. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, she seemed to shrink under his stare. "I didn't know everything," she whispered, "but I knew Jack owed them. I knew he was in deep." "And you didn't stop him?" Father Brown asked, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to know. I thought I could protect him. But now I see what it cost us." Father Brown stepped closer to her, his expression softening. "The truth always comes out, Clara, no matter how hard you try to bury it." She looked at him, her face crumpling, as the weight of her own guilt took hold. "I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be part of it." Father Brown watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "The truth isn't always easy, but it's the only thing that can set you free." As Clara broke down in front of him, Father Brown stepped back, allowing her to face the weight of her own sin. The room was silent, save for the sound of her sobs. But in that silence, Father Brown heard something far more important, the sound of truth being uncovered. The city outside still hummed with its own dark rhythm. But in that small office, there was a moment of clarity, and that, in a place like this, was all that mattered. The truth would always find a way to surface, no matter how deep it was buried. The silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Chapter 12. Father Brown finds the door. The rain hadn't let up. It had started hours ago, and the city had soaked it in like a sponge. The streets glistened with the aftermath of the downpour, reflecting the flickering lights of neon signs that didn't quite hide the darkness beneath them. Father Brown moved through the wet streets, his collar turned up against the chill, his boots making little noise on the slick pavement. In a city like this, the rain didn't cleanse anything. It just made the dirt harder to ignore. He had long ago stopped hoping for the city to clean itself. People came here to drown their sins, and all it did was swallow them whole. The call had come, just as the sky turned purple with the fading light of day. A voice, shaken but controlled, asking him to come to the old office building on the corner of 8th and Hale. "It's urgent," the voice had said. "There's a door here, Father. I need you to find out what's behind it." A door. Simple enough, or so he thought at first. He'd been summoned for stranger things. He had answered calls for help that led him down darker paths. So why should tonight be any different? The address was familiar. He had passed the building countless times, always wondering what secrets it held behind its grime-coated windows and crumbling walls. The building itself had once been a place of promise, but now it was a relic of something long dead, a decaying shell of what it had been. A place where deals were made in the dark and people with too many skeletons in their closets came to hide. Father Brown didn't expect to find anything good here, but that had never stopped him from looking. The door was already ajar when he arrived, the weak light from inside spilling onto the wet sidewalk. There was no one waiting at the entrance, but Father Brown had learned long ago that the lack of an obvious presence often meant that someone was watching. He stepped inside, the musty air clinging to him, heavy with the scent of old wood and stale whiskey. The lobby was dim, lit only by the flickering bulb overhead, its light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the echo of the city outside. He didn't need to be told where to go. His instincts had already led him to the elevator, its old brass doors slightly open, as if inviting him to descend into whatever awaited beneath the surface. The moment he stepped inside, the doors slid shut, and the elevator creaked as it began its descent. The familiar hum of the machine, as it dropped deeper into the building, was a steady reminder of the truth. No one ever went up in a place like this. The people who came here only ever went down. They came seeking things they had lost, or things they wanted to lose. The elevator finally came to a halt, and the doors opened to reveal a long corridor bathed in half-light. It was empty, save for the occasional flicker of a light bulb overhead, and the air was stale, thick with dust and neglect. Father Brown stepped out, the soles of his shoes muffled against the worn carpet, and made his way down the hallway. His steps were methodical, quiet. He wasn't here to make noise. He was here to listen. The door at the end of the hall was the one he was looking for. It was heavier than the others, darker in color, and framed by a series of faded old photographs. Photographs that didn't quite tell a story, only hinted at it. The door itself was thick, wooden, and unmarked. No sign, no nameplate, just a handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Father Brown stood for a moment before he reached for the handle. He hadn't been summoned here by accident. This was the place where the truth had been buried, and he had come to unearth it. He turned the handle and opened the door. Inside was a small room, almost entirely dark, save for the dim light from the hallway spilling in through the crack in the door. The room was empty except for a single desk and a chair, and behind the desk, a figure sat in the shadows. The figure stood as Father Brown entered, but didn't speak at first. There was a pause, a long one, before a woman stepped forward, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention, but her face remained obscured by the shadows, her features hidden, her expression unreadable. "Father Brown," she said, her voice low and controlled, as though she had been expecting him. "I was wondering when you would arrive." Father Brown didn't say anything at first. Instead, he stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in every detail: the dust, the faded wallpaper, the way the shadows clung to the walls like they had never been disturbed. This was a place that had been abandoned by time, and yet it still held something that hadn't been dealt with. "You're here about the door," she continued, stepping closer, her voice carrying an edge that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "I am," Father Brown said quietly, his gaze never leaving her. "But I'm afraid it's not the door that brought me here." The woman raised an eyebrow, though her face remained partially in shadow. "Is that so?" "I've learned to recognize the silence that comes with a door like this," Father Brown continued, his voice calm and steady. "The kind of silence that's been earned through years of hiding, of burying the truth. You've been waiting for someone to come and open it. But you're not looking for help, are you?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped into the light, revealing her features. She was older than Father Brown had expected, her face lined with the weight of years spent living in this city, dealing with its dirt and its lies. Her eyes were sharp, cold, but there was something in them, a flicker of something human, that made Father Brown pause for a moment. "You're not here to help me," she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. "You're here to find out what's behind the door. And I'm afraid the truth isn't as simple as you think." Father Brown didn't flinch. "What's behind the door?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded toward the desk. On it lay a small, unmarked envelope, its edges worn. Father Brown didn't need to be told to open it. The envelope contained a single piece of paper, hastily scribbled with a name that Father Brown had heard once before. It was the name of a man, one who had disappeared years ago, a man who had been caught in a web of corruption and crime, a man who had made enemies out of those who thought themselves untouchable, a man who had paid the price for his choices, but whose disappearance had remained a mystery. "The man in the envelope," Father Brown said, his voice quiet, his expression unreadable. "He's the one you're hiding from." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor as though the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "His name was Charles Larkin," she said softly, "and he was the one who got too close. He knew too much. I tried to warn him, but he didn't listen. He kept digging, and then he disappeared, just like everyone else who gets too close." Father Brown's eyes softened, but his mind was already piecing the story together. "You were involved with him, weren't you?" The woman looked up sharply, her eyes meeting his for the first time, and for a moment there was no hiding the guilt that flickered in them. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. I was involved, but it wasn't what you think. I didn't want to hurt him. But when Charles started talking about exposing the people he was mixed up with, I knew what would happen. He was too dangerous, too much of a risk. Father Brown stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. You're hiding something else, aren't you? Something that links you to his disappearance. She didn't answer at first, but her silence spoke volumes. Finally, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but when he threatened to expose everything, You killed him, Father Brown said softly, not as an accusation, but as a truth that had been hanging in the air between them. You killed him to keep your secrets safe. The woman's breath caught in her throat. I never meant to. I didn't know what else to do. Father Brown looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. Sin has a way of twisting people, doesn't it? It makes them think they have no choice but to bury it. But in the end, sin always finds a way to speak. And when it does, it doesn't matter how hard you try to hide it. She nodded, her eyes falling to the envelope on the desk. I thought if I stayed here long enough, if I kept hiding behind the door, I could forget. But now, it's too late. The truth always comes out. Father Brown nodded slowly. It does. It always does. The woman stood up slowly, wiping away the tears that had fallen. What happens now? Father Brown turned toward the door. Now, you face the truth. The door is open, and the silence is over. As he walked out of the room, the rain had stopped. The streets were silent, save for the distant hum of the city. But Father Brown knew that silence would soon be broken. In a place like this, the truth was always louder than the noise.